Now tonight, we're kicking off the Ginsburg lecture series with a talk on the national security challenges facing the next president, whoever she may be. These challenges, sorry about that if I offended anybody. These challenges will be the topic of the first debate between Clinton and Trump on Monday night of next week. And if you read Robert Gates's essay on Saturday in the Wall Street Journal, he gave you a whole list of the challenges ahead for whoever is the next president, whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, ISIS, cyber, climate change. And most recently, the attacks in New York and New Jersey certainly remind us of the threat here at home. Now, to explore these challenges, there's probably few people better positioned to do so than our speaker tonight, Kori Schake, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution and a member of our Board of Advisors. She has served in the State Department, in the Defense Department, in the National Security Council, serving as Deputy Director of Policy Planning at State, and serving as Director of Defense Requirements and Strategy for the National Security Council. She has taught at Johns Hopkins, the National Defense University, the University of Maryland, and held the Distinguished Chair in International Security Studies at West Point. Her latest book is with General James Mattis, who keynoted our annual dinner a few years ago, called Warriors and Citizens, about the growing divide between society and the military. So, as the two candidates prepare for their debate, our debate preparation begins right now. So please welcome Kori Schake.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I am a huge fan of the work that FPRI does, and I'm a huge fan of the leadership of Alan Luxembourg, who pulls it all together. My favorite thing that they do, which I'm extremely pleased to say that I just finagled myself an invitation to, is a summer seminar teaching high school history teachers. Which I'm going to hold you to that, Alan, because I'm very much looking forward to it. What I would like to do tonight, though, is talk a little bit about what I think the main national security challenges are for the next president. And in my judgment, the most important challenge is actually going to be rebuilding the domestic consensus on America and its role in the world. That unless the next president is able to answer really fundamental questions that I at least thought had long been settled among the American voters, I believe the president will be hobbled in the running of foreign policy and in navigating the challenges the world always throws at the United States. That there are no, as Bob Gates's terrific piece in the Wall Street Journal showed, there are no shortage of important, demanding problems. The few of the outside world that I'm going to talk about tonight are what I call the elevator countries, a rising China and a declining Russia, because I think as a pair they illustrate a similar dynamic. The challenge of organizing countries to stanch the fires that are running wild in the Middle East right now, because I don't think we can afford to ignore them, and I don't think we can afford to do as little as we have been doing these last 7 years. And finally, to work to strengthen international institutions, because that's a key to reclaiming America's stature in the world, and that's what makes our engagement with the world so cost-effective. Let me start by saying that, as all of you know as well as I, 2016 has been an extraordinarily odd election year. And I'm laughing only so I don't cry, actually. And there has been so much nonsense talked by both of the candidates, both of the parties' nominees for president. I actually, even before we get to the last two candidates standing, Did anybody in the room really think it was going to be possible that the Democratic Party would consider nominating somebody who wasn't a Democrat and who went on their honeymoon into the Soviet Union? That for me is a measure of just how odd this election cycle is, that felt okay. And in general, I think, we can talk about the specific politics of it and questions if you like, but as a general rule, I'm actually really shocked at how reckless we are being as voters and as citizens right now. And I have a theory about why that is, and it's because we have been so safe and so prosperous for such a long time that we actually don't think there are consequences, that our margin of error as a country has been so wide, almost no voters, well, for example, they don't think about the fact that we can lose wars and have major consequences associated with it. The days of American prisoners of war held in North Korea or the Bataan Death March are now so distant from our experience and so different from a world in which the expanse of American power has been largely uncontested for at least 30 years. That I think we're actually burning through a very wide margin of error by being reckless. And what I keep hearing as I am watching the presidential politics play out is Juvenal, the Roman poet, wrote in his satires, "Now we suffer the evils of a long peace." And that's actually what this feels like to me. I think Americans, if the platforms and policies being propounded by both candidates for president are actually taken at their face value, they would be terrible for our country. And I think we just are at a moment where people don't think policies matter, and they're so fed up with a government they don't think is listening to them that they're practically ready to vote for, a political arsonist. My fellow Republicans have voted for a political arsonist. So the good news of all of this, after putting that big wet blanket over our conversation tonight, the good news of all of this is that most of America's problems are actually within our own means to correct. No other country in the international order can luxuriate in the fact that most of its problems are actually of its own creation and within its ability to fix. It seems to me that our most daunting problems are domestic because the international order is actually still a pretty positive one as far as America's interests are concerned. But that the big problem is, right now it seems to me the reason that our politics feel so fraught and voters are feeling so reckless is that actually we are in a time of enormous economic and social upheaval. The two periods of comparison that come to mind for me, the first is the 1890s, right? Where technological change is happening so much, urbanization has advanced so fast, immigration is occurring in large numbers, and out of that grew the progressive movement that created labor rights and labor unions and brought in all manner of positive change, because eventually politicians and the American political system in its genius, I say, sitting here in Philadelphia, was designed to be tied tightly to American public attitudes. And so sooner or later, politicians figure out how to solve the public's problems. And in the 1890s, a period of enormous innovation and enormous social change, what came out of it was the progressive movement, which tamed some of the more raucous forces that were causing people so much concern. The second historical time period that feels to me a little bit like what we're experiencing right now is the 1820s and 1830s, when Andrew Jackson becomes president of the United States. You have a classic establishment figure, John Quincy Adams, right? Unquestionably the best qualified candidate by possibly ever to run for American president. He had been the Secretary of State. He was the son of a founding father. He'd been an American emissary, caught in a very close race with a celebrity politician, a guy who not only advocated war crimes, he committed them, Andrew Jackson, a guy who had Native American allies that he then stripped of their rights, property, and sent on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. A guy who understood so little finance, he disestablished the Second Bank of New York, which was at that time the Federal Reserve of these United States, dumping the country into 15 years of recession. Who was asked, as his presidency was coming to an end, Andrew Jackson was asked if he had any regrets about his presidency, and he said he had two, that he had never been able to shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun. So again, the good news out of this is that we are a country with a political system with an enormous amount of checks and balances in it. In fact, in my judgment, the likeliest outcome, if my party's nominee is elected, will actually be a grinding to a halt of most of America's business, as the president attempts to do by executive order what Congress and the courts and journalists and public protests prevent. That's how our political system is designed to handle these kinds of outliers. And I'm utterly confident that if Alan has called the presidential election wrong, that the country won't go over a cliff. But it takes me back to my point about the challenges for the next president, because we don't actually have 4 or 8 years to waste. We have problems that we need to solve as a country, and they are predominantly domestic problems. I think the most important one is rebuilding the consensus in favor of an active and engaged American foreign policy. And that seems to me very much in doubt this election, right? Donald Trump's notion that somehow immigration is a danger to our country rather than our historic source of enrichment and economic vitality and diversity of ideas. The notion that we can somehow, Hillary Clinton's notion that somehow the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership is bad foreign policy and bad economics. She knows better than that. She negotiated the agreement. And yet we are in a point where politicians are so fearful of a public recklessness that they don't understand, that they're just casting about for anything that's gonna grab onto. I think that in addition to making the case, we need to make these case to our fellow Americans, and we need to win the arguments for an active and engaged foreign policy, for rebalancing entitlement spending so that we don't crowd out the discretionary spending on which our diplomacy and our military rely. And the third is rekindling an appreciation for what alliances give us. Because mostly the reason the United States is successful in the world is because other people want us to succeed. We don't actually have to force our will very often. And when we do have to force our will, a lot of other countries help us do it. And that is a great and underrated blessing for our country that we have been taking advantage quite a lot. President Obama, I think, has done a disservice to America's allies by the way he has been talking about how much they take advantage of us. And of course, Donald Trump is the extreme end of that by suggesting that somehow we shouldn't defend countries that share our values and help us protect our interests unless they pay the prescribed fee he is going to charge them. But in order to get to those conversations, we have to start by addressing the intensity of voter disaffection. Because until we do that, foreign policy as practiced for the last 70 years is going to be out of reach to us. we're not going to be able to come up with sensible policies for the Middle East, for managing a rising China, managing a declining Russia, helping keep the Europeans interested in the world outside of Europe. I think the three basic questions that I and all of you need to be talking to our fellow Americans are why should we care? Why don't other countries care more? And what do we get from trade? Because I actually think until we answer those to American satisfaction, so I'm going to take a shot at it tonight, and please grade me. Let me know how I'm doing and how to improve it better. So the first question, why do we care, is really a question about our leadership, right? Why do we have to be the people to solve stuff? Why doesn't anybody else do anything? And the first thing to say is that, of course, others do things, right? We focus on the problems we're worried about. When I was the director for defense strategy on the NSC, I was responsible for managing the coalition of countries that had troops fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the complaint that those 56 countries' representatives would always come back to us and say is, you're never worried about our problems, but as soon as you have a problem, you expect us to drop everything and focus on what you're worried about. Our problems are actually harder than your problems. And that's a perspective that we in the United States often lose track of. But Americans are unquestionably worried by the pace of change they're experiencing and the economic dislocation. That's focused narrowly on trade, right? Trade is increasingly unpopular with Americans, which we have failed as an establishment in not helping our fellow Americans understand that 40% of everything imported into the United States goes into goods that are then made in the United States. If we make trade expensive, we make American manufacturing impossible, right? The second thing is that much more so than trade, it is technological innovation that is driving the tumult that we are seeing. It is not Mexican drivers and the NAFTA trade treaty that is going to make truck driving go away as a profession. It's self-driving trucks that are going to make that happen. And Americans are afraid of the magnitude of the change they're seeing. My favorite example, I think the politician who does it best, is Tim Pawlenty, former governor of Minnesota. His father was a truck driver, and on a truck driver's salary, his mother could stay at home and raise 5 children with no other source of income. That profession is gone. And we as a community of Americans need to figure out both help people understand what's coming next, right? Because every period of great economic innovation that we have seen in history, there are always these fears. Jobs are going away. Think of the British Luddites in the 19th century, right? Breaking weaving looms with hatchets. But in fact, what new technology does is create new professions out of the tumult. So we need to help our fellow Americans be confident that where we're headed is also a place of lots of jobs, in fact, better jobs than they had. And we have to have a transition plan for helping us through it. And both Republicans and Democrats have a vested interest in defanging public opposition to trade and public opposition to innovation. We are only 5% of the world's population. We cannot be a prosperous country unless we are engaged with the rest of the world. There is just no arithmetic that gets you to a prosperous America if we are shut off from the rest of the world. Which is not to say that our security would suffer, right? We are strong enough to preserve our liberty, but the disorder that is going to burgeon around the world, and that in fact I think we have been seeing burgeon around the world as President Obama has stepped back somewhat from our engagement with the world. That disorder throws sand in the gears. And the United States has a wider margin of error than other countries do, but it will still affect us. So we need to have a conversation about how the international economy benefits us. It's not, trade isn't something that other people steal from us. It is how we engage with the world, how we create prosperity for them and for us. And President Obama has actually been quite unhelpful in this. I don't mean to be partisan about this, but I do think the way he opposed NAFTA as stealing American jobs, that the Canadians were taking our jobs from us, has put him in an awkward position now as the negotiator of a trade pact with 19 countries throughout the Pacific that is the major foreign policy accomplishment of his administration. He will be hard-pressed to make that sail well. But the United States, the angst American voters are feeling is not unique to us. The sentiments are common across the developed Western countries, as of course you all can see in Britain, in France, and Germany. You know, Theodore Roosevelt, but I think it's hitting the United States the hardest. And my theory about why comes from Theodore Roosevelt. When he came to California campaigning for president, he wrote, "I do not feel like I'm in the West when I'm in California. California is west of the West," right? Everything that you conjure up about the West, California has it in the extreme form. And I actually think that's true of the United States relative to the rest of the liberal order that we have ushered in. And that's because we are a more diverse country than any of the other Western countries. Our politics are more divisive. The dimensions of our power are so much broader than other countries. And we have endeavored in the time of our primacy in the international order to make the international order a macrocosm of our own domestic politics, right? We, as a general rule, don't believe it's good enough to leave other countries to their fate. We want to create, we believe that this might be a good time to suggest folks might want to turn their phones off. But that we have created an international order in which if you opt into it, the same rules apply to everybody, and those rules have been extraordinarily beneficial. Let me just challenge you in the audience. Can anybody think of a country that is stable and prosperous, but outside the American order? Say again? Luxembourg is not outside the American order, but good call. Anybody else? Switzerland is not outside the American order. It's not an American ally. Luxembourg is an American ally, but all of the things you think about representative government and the rule of law and tolerance apply in Switzerland as well. The only two countries I can think of that could argue they are outside the American order are North Korea, right, which is unconnected to the international order, and Iran before the nuclear agreement. And those typically aren't models other countries want to emulate, which is good for us because it goes back to this notion of soft power. We don't have to enforce our will. Our prosperity and the attractiveness of our values and our laws does most of our work for us. So the second question that I want to talk about is, can we afford to continue playing the kind of outsized role that the United States has in the last 70 years in the international order? Because it has come up both in the Obama administration and in Donald Trump's campaigning that we can't afford to do this anymore. And I would suggest to you that also the affordability question is a domestic policy question. And there are two elements to it. The first is our national debt, and the second is the encroachment of entitlement spending into the discretionary area of the budget. And I know this is a little bit green eye shade. Deep in my heart, I'm an insurance actuary. So just hang with me for a couple of minutes on this. As many of you know, America's national debt has now topped $20 trillion. We add $2.4 million a day to it. This is the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in our country's history, and we should be thoroughly ashamed of ourselves for doing it, because we have done so at a time where the country has not had major challenges like World War II or pulling the country out of the Great Depression. We are indulging ourselves to the detriment of our children, and we need to fix this problem. The only reason it has been sustainable this long is because of what a French president once called the exorbitant privilege of the United States dollar as safe harbor, as the international holding currency. And the way the tumult of the 2008 financial crisis has kept interest rates at a sustained low level. Neither of those are things that are good planning assumptions going forward into the future. The Chinese currency will be a holding currency. Bitcoin with a blockchain business is coming along fast. We're lucky we have gotten this far, and we need to fix the problem of spending more money than we are providing our government in revenue. Moreover, it doesn't just matter for our own country, it matters in terms of the soft power of how we look to the world. When we look like we can't govern ourselves, it makes it much harder for the United States to tell, for example, the president of Egypt, how he should govern his country, or the prime minister of Iraq, how he should govern his country. We need to get our own house in order. It's more expensive to get other countries to cooperate with us when we don't have our house in order. The second part of this, which is the encroachment of entitlements, right? If interest rates go up, and interest rates will go up eventually, we're talking about a 50-year time frame for this debt hangover to be paid out. When interest rates go up, it will crowd discretionary spending out of the budget. Currently, defense spending is roughly 25% of the federal budget. And it is going to get crowded out as we start to have to pay out entitlements if we don't get an entitlement deal that makes it sustainable, that makes retirement and medical care sustainable forward into the future for today's 30-year-olds. We actually need to do that. There's also a DoD component about the affordability, which is, as you know, the United States is extraordinarily generous to its military. We spend about 3.5% of our GDP. That's about $600 billion a year on our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And it's a great investment. But the exact same budget dynamic that you see in the federal budget, which is entitlements crowding out discretionary spending, you also see internal to the defense budget. That is, Congress so likes giving pay raises to the men and women in our military, and their health care is getting so expensive that it is crowding out the money for training, crowding out the money for research and development, crowding out the money for weapons procurement. It's the exact same dynamic you see in the larger budget, and because Congress no member of Congress gets elected running against the American military, they are showing their appreciation by giving them pay raises without understanding that, as all of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs and service chiefs have testified, they actually need to move that money into operations. Congress won't allow it to happen, and they need to. But if we fix those things, I'm actually quite confident, hard as they are to fix, difficult and boring, and I'm in favor of boring good government. And we need that if we are going to solve our problems. And we need to solve those problems because here's what's coming on the horizon. At the end of the Cold War, Frank Fukuyama, a famous American political scientist, wrote a book called The End of History. And it gets a lot of ridicule because, of course, history's not over. But But what he argued, I still think is true, which is that the Cold War was a competition of ideologies, right? Beliefs about the relationship of people and their government. And that with the end of the Cold War, it was hard to see an ideology that had the popular dynamism to be able to challenge the United States. I think in 2002-03, we worried that perhaps political Islam was that alternative. But I think what we are seeing in the Middle East is that it too has to be imposed by force, with the exception of Egypt, which I'd love to talk about if anyone wants to ask any questions. But Frank Fukuyama's argument was that there's no intellectual challenge to the liberal order of the West. And now we actually have that intellectual challenge. And it's authoritarian capitalism. It's Russia and China. Societies that are unfree, in which the government is making a bet that if they can produce prosperity, people won't demand liberty, right? Our fundamental belief as Americans is that good things go together, that free people create dynamic economies. And so far, we have been proven right, with the big outlying exception of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And I use the example advisedly because those two, as well as this Russia and this China, are unfree societies with dynamic economies. And whether they can sustain that, whether they will provoke wars that will be the destruction of their power, whether they will so enrage their own populations that the elite holding power won't be able to contain it, it really is the important international policy question of our time, because Russia is a threat to us as it falls. China is a threat to us as it rises. But they both have the same dynamic of governments that believe that they do not need freedom in order to keep control of their societies. In terms of the Middle East, a really awful person in the Obama administration gave a really awful quote to in a newspaper article where they threw their hands up about the crisis in Syria and said, well, look, President Bush tried intervening in the Middle East and that didn't work. We tried staying out of the Middle East and that didn't work. So, what can you do? And that is so shockingly disrespectful to the long-suffering people of the region that I hope you will not give in to the belief that nothing can be done, that nothing productive can be done, that nothing hopeful and helpful can be done. Because our failures in the Middle East, both in the Obama administration and in the Bush administration, are failures of policy and strategy. There is no law of gravity that is inexorable that the Middle East cannot get fixed. It's simply not true. We need better policies. And let me give you my favorite example, which I hope we can talk about the Middle East more in the questions. But my favorite example is the choice we made at the end of the 1991 Iraq War, in which we took a swath of northern Iraq, put it under our protection, both by air and on the ground, protected the people, the refugees who were living there, and agreed we were going to do it indefinitely, that we were going to bring humanitarian aid agencies in and let them do anything useful they could do for these people, that we were going to protect them against all challenges, and we were going to do it until you grew a leadership out of that population who were capable of governing it in the way we believed was good for them and good for us. And the Kurdish regions of northern Iraq are now the great sectarian success story of the Middle East. That actually worked because they wanted a future different than their past. And we could and should be doing many other such things without great cost to ourselves and with great positive effect on a problem that is creating insecurity for us and decimating to the people of the Middle East. In conclusion, let me just say there's a poet and novelist, Charles Bukowski, who asks the question that I love, which is, why is it always a matter of choosing between something bad and something worse? And that's what foreign policy is actually like most of the time, right? We would like to be able to start from scratch, not to have to deal with all the bad hangover. You know, President Obama liked to say that President Bush drove the country into a ditch and now he had to get out of it. And he's right, but every American president, well, maybe George Washington didn't, but just about every American president that could be laid at their doorstep. Doesn't matter. You have to play the ball where it lies. And for the United States, we actually have problems that other countries wish they could trade their problems in for. And we have lost our perspective on that in this overheated political cycle. The next president is going to have to engage and win arguments about America's role in the world, about how to make that role affordable, how to manage the problem states of Russia and China, and how, at least to some extent, to quell the furor in the Middle East. But I would encourage you, my friends, to think about which country you trust to set the rules if we are not the country setting the rules. Because ultimately, that's the question about America's disengagement for the world. Would you really like an international order where we are required to abide by the rules that some of the countries we are worried about their behavior get to set? Thank you.
Could you please tell us to what extent you think that North Korea represents a threat to us and our interests, and how specifically do we deal with that threat?
Yeah. Yes, I think North Korea is a serious threat to our interests, in part because they seem so intent on proving themselves so, right? You know, those are political scientists who work on, you know, whether governance matters, love the example of the Koreas, right? Because in 1950, they start out in the same place. And now, I think I'm at least in the ballpark with the numbers that the per capita GDP in North Korea is about $9,000 a person, and it's about $35,000 a person in South Korea. This is the difference that good governance makes in a society, the rule of law, and in South Korea's case, eventually, liberal government as well. One of the scariest things about North Korea is I don't know anybody who thinks they know anything about North Korea, right? Even people who study North Korea, some of them will argue he's not crazy. He's doing this on purpose. But they can't prove it, right? And the people who argue the other direction can't prove it either. The facts that we can tell you are that North Korea is working assiduously on a nuclear weapons program and on a ballistic missile program that can range the United States. All of you probably saw the picture from last year of the North Korean dictator, you know, joking about pushing the button to launch missiles that show Colorado Springs and other Los Angeles, other American cities. So yeah, we should be worried by anybody who behaves that way and who has those abilities. One of the real disappointments, I think, of the Obama administration's tight focus on getting a nuclear agreement with Iran was that they did not engage North Korea. And I don't mean it as a sharp-edged criticism, right? Nobody's gotten anywhere with North Korea. The Clinton administration tried it, the Bush administration tried, nobody's getting anywhere. And the dimensions of the problem are that South Korea is so much at risk right? The capital of South Korea is in artillery range of North Korea. So you can't fight the North Koreans without having to cede South Korea's destruction. And so there's a strong incentive not to risk war on the part of everybody except the North Koreans. The Chinese have hitherto been our North Korea's closest ally and have hitherto been a little soft on the North Koreans from an American perspective, in part because they seem to be genuinely fearful the government's going to collapse, and when it does, everyone in North Korea is going to flee to China for more food, for more opportunity. They are trying to keep the North Korean government solvent and in place. What I think we should be doing that we're not doing is I think the Chinese might be amenable to a deal if we could make the Chinese secure in the belief that we would not move in and occupy North Korea if the government falls. And that if we got a stable peace on the Korean peninsula, we would be willing to reconsider the stationing of US troops in South Korea. That is, we would give up the enormous strategic advantage and sense of security that the South Koreans draw from American forces if, after this North Korean government falls, we and the Chinese can untangle the nuclear threat that the North Koreans pose. That we have to somehow get the Chinese to cut their links to the North Koreans. Otherwise, sanctions don't work anymore. We've done all we can on all sorts of other fronts. So it's actually a really hard problem because there aren't many levers to use and the Chinese aren't inclined to help us use them. So yeah, we should be worried about it. I'm of the belief that it's a hard call on whether you buy off the North Korean government with food aid, as the Bush administration did, provide food aid in return for them not continuing their nuclear tests. But on balance, I would take that deal right now. I'm not worried about them. Yes, Trudy.
In this election season, could you talk a little about what you would envision the situation to be like if Donald Trump won? A couple of years from now, do you think America's alliances would be in great jeopardy, and what would be the costs of that? And on the other side of the aisle, if Hillary Clinton won, what do you think it would take from her in order to reestablish the belief abroad that America was still America, and the respect for American leadership?
Yeah. Fantastic questions, both. I'll start with the easy one first. If Hillary Clinton gets elected president, there will be an enormous sigh of relief from America's friends everywhere in the world, right? Like the governments and the people who mean us well in the world think we have lost our minds that we have nominated Donald Trump on the Republican ticket. So if Clinton is elected, I think you will see this sort of deep, maybe we misjudge them kind of reaction from America's friends around the world. And what could she do to help cement that? The best thing she could do to cement that would be to engage in the political contortions that allow her to support the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, because she has campaigned against it. Even though she negotiated it, it somehow mysteriously came out as a bad deal for the American worker. And in fact, Clinton could do an enormous service for American national security by making the case that trade is good for the United States, that we're a major trading power and it makes us prosperous. and cementing the kind of standard-setting agreements that the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership would. What trade does for the United States is not just open markets for us, but it is slowly bringing global labor standards up to those of the United States. And that's good for people who care about the climate. That's good for people who care about labor standard, child labor, and those issues. It's good for people who want a reasonable standard of living, because that's going to make American products more advantageously marketed around the world. My guess about what Clinton will do, Alan, I'll wager a beer with you on this, that if Clinton is elected, she will somehow find a way to get Congress to pass a 15-cent an hour improvement in something that she can sell as improved benefits for American workers. It'll have to be unilateral, because otherwise you can't bring it back into the treaty. Find something by which she can say, I changed the agreement, made it better for the American worker, and now I need Democrats in Congress to vote for this. That would be the biggest thing, because for America's friends around the world, the fact that she negotiated the agreement and is saying it's a bad agreement makes the reliability of what she is telling them somewhat suspect. So that would be great. I also think she did a great thing yesterday in talking to President Sisi in New York when he was there for the UN General Assembly, because she didn't pull her punches. There is an American the Egyptian government is holding. She raised that case with President al-Sisi. She talked about the importance of political liberties and the rule of law, in addition to talking about our common security concerns. I thought she hit the balance just exactly right. So fixing trade policy, and of course I think she should fix the domestic problems I raised, which is getting entitlements on a sounder footing and stop spending more money than we have. I don't see anything in her campaign platform that she understands arithmetic, though. There's a big whopping sticker price for all sorts of things she's promising this campaign. Which brings us to Donald Trump. So I'm one of the 50 Republican national security leaders who signed a letter saying that we not only don't support Donald Trump's policies, we won't vote for him, we won't work for him, we think he's unfit to be commander-in-chief. I genuinely believe Donald Trump's election would be a disaster for our country, not just because his policies are nonsense and likely to have terrible economic and foreign policy consequences, but also because of the disrespect he has shown to so many of our fellow Americans.
Why don't you tell us what you really think?
How's that for casting a pall over the crowd? I'm quite serious, though. I think this is a really consequential election, and it was a political question, Alan, so please forgive me for pontificating, but I do genuinely believe that it's a dangerous world out there, and it will be a more dangerous world for the United States if Donald Trump is elected. That as a conservative Republican, it was for me a great agonizing decision to endorse Clinton, and I only do it with enormous misgivings. But it seems to me unquestionable that he is a danger to our country. So back to foreign policy, please. Yes, sir.
So a couple of the problems that you addressed are the polarization of the United States in terms of political issues, and the polarization of the United States in terms of education and the education gap, and the fact that our grandchildren who will go to college and will get graduate degrees ought to be able to do well in the mechanized future that's going to come to pass. How do we address these problems? I agree these are problems. How do we address these problems and attempt to depolarize the population and take the, I don't know, 50% of the people that are high school graduates and still can't even read the New York Times, forgive my perspective. How do we begin to address those issues?
So I am so grateful that my task tonight was just saving the world. It wasn't actually saving the American education system. But let me maybe say two things, because I think you raise a hugely important point. And one is that if I know your zip code, I can probably tell you the quality of education your children are getting. And that didn't used to be the case in the United States. And I genuinely believe that access to education is the major civil rights issue of our time, and that helping restore the opportunity for people who don't live in zip codes where they get good educations is a huge part of our challenge. And we ought to be trying 1,000 keys in the lock, right? The Boys and Girls Club, after-school tutoring, charter schools, but anything and everything we ought to try because we need to fix that problem. I think you're exactly right. On college students, so I'm a teacher of college students, and I actually think they're fine. In fact, I think they're better than fine. I think they're sparkly and hardworking. And one of the things, Alan mentioned that Jim Mattis and I just have a book out on the civil-military gap. And in doing the research for the book, we actually did the largest surveys of American public attitudes about the military that have been done since 1998. We were curious that there hadn't been a big survey of what America thinks about its military. So we designed a bunch of surveys. YouGov, the polling firm, ran them for us. And one of the most interesting anomalies in the data was that 18 to 29-year-olds, while they are personally very progressive in their views on social and political issues, are very conservative about the military. And I don't know if you all notice this with the young people in your lives, but I notice it with my students, and I noticed it in the data from this, that they are much more conservative on economic and national security issues than are 30 to 39-year-olds, 40 to 49-year-olds, 50 to 59-year-olds. And I don't have the answer to why that is. We weren't able to pull that out from the data. But my guess is that having come of age after the 2008 financial crisis and having come of age after September 11th, 2001, their reflexes are closer to the reflexes of the World War II generation than they are to any of us since then. And I think that's actually, like, it's sad that they had to earn that judgment, but I actually think that's a hugely hopeful thing for the country, that there is a seriousness of purpose about getting jobs, about economic security, about national security, that is greater than in my age cohort or the cohorts in between. So I'm actually quite optimistic. Anybody else? Yes, sir, in the back.
On the subject of the national conversation and bridging the gap and the dealing with the polarization, could you tell me who you would cite or who you pay attention to on the populist side?
I'm sorry, on the populist side?
Yes.
I understand. Sorry, it took me a minute. I actually think one of the big questions about the election will be, if Donald Trump wins, he will redefine what it means to be a Republican, right? And having carried the votes to win, he will have earned that right. If he loses by a little, if he loses by a lot, it will be tempting for the Republican establishment and some in the media to suggest that it was a moment, not a movement, and we don't have to worry about this. I would argue, though, that what we should do is treat it as if Trump loses by just a little. That is, we actually need to respect that people are voting for him for a reason, and we need to find out what those reasons are, acknowledge that our policy choices have failed to solve their problems, and find policy solutions consistent, in the case of Republicans, consistent with conservative principles that meet it.
Actually asking for a name would fit. In other words,
oh, who I'd like to see.
If the conversation actually exists, I've heard this point of view fairly consistently. I'm just wondering who you would cite and who you would refer us to understand the populist point of view, if anyone, a name.
So there's a lot of polling that's out now on the populist view. Who represent? I think a lot of Republicans in Congress are smart people to listen to, because they're having to run in this campaign environment. So they are having to listen carefully to what voters are saying and try and do the crosswalk. I wish I could say Paul Ryan, because he's my favorite elected Republican, but I think he is actually out of tune with some of the populist sentiment. I'm not sure he understands it as well as Ted Cruz or some of the other folks who got better traction among the Republican presidential candidates. But yes, I do think we actually have to, we conservatives have lost the argument, and we have to win it. We have to go out and talk about trade and why it's good for people, and defang these kinds of concerns that people have. So I think who else would I put in that category? Well, I would put all of the folks on National Review who are writing about this have been very good on the subject. Who else would I say? Anybody else have voices you want to volunteer for who understands the populist moment in America? Yeah, I think it's a work in progress. I don't think we know yet. Any other questions? Somebody save me from a topic I didn't know.
If I can get you off the hook on the domestic stuff, I just was curious if you could give a minute to talk about the Iranians and their sort of
yes, thank you.
Kind of off the wall, I'll just let you.
Thank you for giving me the end of the world to talk about instead of American domestic politics. I appreciate it. So the Iranian nuclear deal. I think it's a bad deal, and I nonetheless endorse it. And here's the reason that I do. That I think President Obama's policy, which is that we would destroy the Iranian nuclear agreement if they did not, we would destroy the Iranian nuclear weapons program if they did not enter into an agreement with us. I do not believe that was a credible threat. And because I do not believe it's a credible threat, I think a deal that provides us the kind of intelligence, opportunities, the kind of restraints on known Iranian nuclear weapons activity, and the kind of continued international cooperation that the Iran agreement gives us is better than a policy that we had no intention of carrying out. And I think everybody in the region knew we had no intention of carrying out. What I very fervently wish the Obama administration would do now that they have the Iranian agreement is move forward assertively to address the other 4 threats that Iran poses in addition to its nuclear weapons program. Destabilizing countries in the region, Bahrain, Lebanon, Syria. Second threat that they pose is to free passage in the Straits of Hormuz. They lay mines, you've seen they've been buzzing American ships, and not just for commercial reasons, but also for innocent passage in sea and other things that they are interdicting. The third threat that the Iranians pose is terrorism. They tried to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador in Washington, D.C. they are the main state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and we ought to be reining that in. And the fourth threat that the Iranians pose is the human rights threat that this government poses to their own people. The tens of thousands of people that they rounded up after the 2009 parliamentary election, the torture of political prisoners in Iranian prisons. We ought to be a loud voice, at least as loud a voice as we are in Egypt and other places, on the side of the Iranian people and against their government. Thank you for that question. I'm very grateful for you saving me from the quandary of American politics.
And thank you for those remarks. I think that was a lot of bad news delivered in the most upbeat manner I've ever witnessed. So we thank you for that. And also, very many practical, constructive suggestions for U.S. policy going forward, and great preparation for Monday's big debate. So thank you, Kori. Join me in thanking Kori.